General Ray is commander of the Air Force Global Strike Command and commander of Air Force Strategic U.S. Strategic Command at Barksdale Air Force Base. AFGSC provides strategic deterrence, global strike, and combatant support to USSTRATCOM and other geographic combatant commands. The command is comprised of more than 33,000 professionals operating at 2 numbered air forces, 11 active duty, Air National Guard, and Air Force Reserve wings. The Joint Global Strike Operations Center and the Nuclear Command and Control Communications Center. Weapon systems assigned to the AFGSC include all U.S. Air Force intercontinental ballistic missiles and bomber aircraft, UH-1N helicopters, E-4B National Airborne Operations Center aircraft, and the remaining U.S. Air Force NC-3 weapon systems. General Ray earned his commission from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1985. He completed undergraduate pilot training and has held operational flying assignments on the T-38 and B-52 and served as an instructor, evaluator pilot, and squadron commander. He's also flown the B-1 and commanded the 7th Bomb Wing at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas. General Ray has had various staff assignments at the Major Command Headquarters of U.S. Air Force and combatant command levels and has served as Commanding General of NATO Air Training Command in Afghanistan, Training NATO Mission in Afghanistan, Combined Security Transition Command, and commander of the 438th Air Expeditionary Wing in Kabul, Afghanistan. Prior to his current assignment, General Ray has served as Deputy Commander of United States European Command in Stuttgart, Germany. Please welcome General Timothy Ray.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all the distinguished guests. It's an honor to be with you here today. So I got the email on Thursday afternoon of last week. I'm going to tell this story on Admiral Creedy before he gets up and runs away. I said, hey, would you mind being the keynote speaker for us next Wednesday? I said, I was going to be at the conference, so why not, right? So only to find out there's a whole lot more going on here. So with that kind of notification, as a 4-star, you either need to be really smart and think of something fast, or you have to have a good staff. So if this is really good, it was all me, right? In sincerity, my staff has been a big help. Thanks for making the time to come here. I see a lot of dignitaries from all over the planet. I see industry partners, lots of our teammates here across the command, OSD. So it's a pretty august group. I was asked to talk about deterrence. And I thought about that and I said, well, why don't we think about this a little differently? So I'm not going to give you the, hey, this is about denying the enemy's ability to achieve their objectives or to instill upon them, intolerable consequences. That's a classic conversation. And it's not about capability times will. I think everybody in here understands that. But I think it's really too simple for the world I'll call the NDS world, the National Defense Strategy world, because I believe that's a much more important context to think about. So when I took over command almost a year ago, we had just come from European Command, so I know Ken Stallworthy and some previous compatriots in crime as we worked on things in the NDS and the NMS and dynamic force employment and how all that really worked in the competitive space. I thought a lot differently about those classic words of compete, deter, and win. And I asked the team when I got there, I said, okay, there's 3 words here, which one's most important? And there was a lot of them who had said it was about winning. And my concern was, at that time, we were really working on the readiness plus up. And so I knew a lot of the airmen there would go, well, here's my state of readiness and the delta between where I am and where I want to be, so I got to go think about whether or not I can win. And I said, that's why I'm not hanging my hat on win for now. And then I said, okay, what about the second word? And so, well, deterrence obviously is, and I rocked a few worlds, and I think some of the teammates from Global Strike are here, and I said, hey, I'm not in the deterrence business. The forks just stopped. I just noticed that. The president is in the deterrence business, the vice president, the secretary of defense, the secretary of state, the chairman and the combatant commanders, they are in the deterrence business. I am in the warfighting business. Okay? And I think that's an important conversation to make sure remains front and center. As I talked about that with the team, you know, that to some, warfighting and deterrence are the same, but to some, they are not. And I think that if you begin to start putting a word that kind of relates to both, one is a threat and one is a promise. And I think that there's a slippery slope when that gap gets too big and it becomes more the threat than the promise. Then I think we miss the crux of what really needs to be in the forefront is the promise that we are going to go meet our obligations and that we'll rise to the occasion in the toughest of circumstances. And so that took a lot of talking about, and you know, after a while, folks finally started to understand. And just so you know I'm not out on a limb. I did go and I talked to a lot of very important people. I talked to General Welch, General Larry Welch. You don't go into this job without spending some time talking to him, if you know what's good for you. I talked to General Hyten about it. I talked to General Goldfein. And I'll tell you, there's zero difference with my particular take on that. And so I think what that leaves us then is the most important word in the NDS is compete. Competition is what this is all about. And after years of the counterterrorism mission, it is probably more important than ever. The things in front of us are more strategically and politically challenging than what we've faced. And so to get to the crux of competition and really get the grist of what that means is an important lift. Let me talk about that a little bit more here. I tell the team that there's 3 dimensions to the competition we're in. Right now, we are in this global competition, this NDS world, the challenges with China, with Russia, with North Korea and Iran. And certainly there'll always be an undercurrent of contention or a more mainstream current of counterterrorism and the stability inside our governed spaces. So that's always going to be there. And I think that's something that we'll talk about how that context shifts. We are in a competition for resources. And that's no trivial thing. We have the blessing of a very, very good budget. You know, I tell my team to be very mindful of the fact that many of our allies and partners would love to have, you know, a part of the budget that we have. And, you know, I am pretty realistic in that we're blessed with a significant budget. But we're not going to spend our way out of this. There's no way that can be sustained. And so when we start thinking about the competition for resources inside our own government, there's many things that need to be done inside of our own government, inside our own department, and within our own, between the services, and of course, you know, the demand every day of the COCOMs and what's going on now versus what's happening in the future. So that is an incredibly important dimension of competition. The third dimension is a competition for talent. And there are 2 parts of that I think are really important. And I know some of my industry partners are in here. I've seen a few of you, but my ability to command the very best of industry, that competition for talent in an economy that is on fire, the ability to bring the best of the tech, the best of the design, the best of the marketplace and to produce. And so what I tell our Congress is, you giving me a budget on time means I have less of a chance of commanding the bottom third of the software enterprise, that I have to be a more competitive entity in this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so I believe in those 3 key pieces of competition. And in a recent conversation, and I've had several here in the past year with General Welch, and he was there advising us about 2.5 weeks ago, and I had the fortune of having dinner with him. And he said, you know, my world was very different than yours. You know, you have a far, far more complicated challenge. So as we bring in the absolutely necessary underpinnings of our two legs of the triad and the command and control to underpin it, and as we as a military bring in all three legs to recapitalize, how we do that is going to be significantly challenged. He said, when I was doing this, you know, I really only had one thing to worry about, and that was time. See, these were the president's programs. Okay, money mattered, but not as much as being on time. And so here's an example. When you look at the B-1 bomber, he explained to me that had they had a couple more years, they would have done more integration and systems development that would have given us even greater reliability, but they had to put it on the ramp on time. And he, back under that acquisition system, was the accountable individual to the President and the Secretary of Defense. And so a very different reality. He had plenty of money. And so I thought about that even more, and I said, okay, so when he speaks, you need to spend some time really reflecting on that. And so I did. And I just kind of asked myself, okay, how has this worked over time? And I look back broadly, and there's probably some much smarter people than me that can tell me how wrong I was about the 40s and the 80s. And yes, I was alive in the 80s, not in the 40s. But let's just kind of step back for a second. If you go back to the 40s, where we were building a significant capability to deal with the challenges, there was a very clear consensus in our nation about what was going on and what we had to do and what it took to do it. Okay, the war bonds and the rationing and the challenges, the millions it served, the people who built. That national consensus was very, very straightforward. When I think about the 80s, you know, in the Cold War, there were plenty of those who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and people who had to jump underneath their desks for the air raid drills back in those days. And I know Pat McVeigh was probably one of those guys who was doing that. You're not getting away. But people remembered that tense time. People remembered how close we were. And so when it came to a national consensus about getting that arsenal correct and competing with the Soviet Union, that wasn't very hard. And so now I'll fast forward to another roughly 40 years later. Where is the national consensus now? Where is the national consensus on Russia? Where is the national consensus on China, on Iran, or North Korea? Those are very interesting questions. And so when we think about what we have to do to move forward, we have to make sure we understand, and I'll use a nautical term, some very stiff headwinds to sail against or to fly against, because it means that there's a lot more to explain. There's more competing demands. Another dimension, the international consensus. You go back to the 40s and it was the Axis and the Allies. And we are very fortunate now to have many teammates, great allies who were in a different place. But internationally, everybody understood what was going on. In the 80s, there was this dimension of the Warsaw Pact and communism versus the West. And that wasn't hard to think through, right? So if you go back and look at the map of Europe and what was the Warsaw Pact and looked at what Europe, the free Europe was, that's actually a pretty thin slice. My time in Europe got me to look at that a little closer, because now you look at it and the tables are turned on President Putin. You know, but that was a very different situation back then. And now you step forward into the current dynamic, and it's very interesting. You've got a very mixed set of national focus items in Europe. You've got them all over the planet. And you could make the argument broadly, and I'm not going to advocate one way or the other, but when the Cold War ended, we had an amazing opportunity where it was a monopolar world and the Western model worked. But then always in the backdrop were those who had a different idea, those who had lost sphere of influence, who were still very much of the realist camp, and they never let go of what was happening. And those resentments simmered. I will tell you they were there. But when you look at the devastation of World War II, and I believe I'm speaking to my American friends, because my European friends get this, and my Asian friends get this, the millions and millions of people who were wounded or killed, and all the wars combined for the United States military, we have not lost 1 million people in conflict. And so the sense of social price tag, while we did endure some challenges, we've not been through anything like those in Asia and Europe have been through. And so it's a reality that some of them see the world in a more liberal, globalist approach, stemming from the opportunity at the end of the Cold War. But there are some also who are in a more realist camp, and perhaps a little bit more on the nationalist side. And I'm not going to talk to you about whether or not that's good or bad, and I know some will throw those words around from either side of that particular conversation. But all you need know is we are not of one mind when it comes to that. Right? And that's a particularly important dimension. You look at now, well, I'll go back to reading Kissinger's World Order. In his book, he describes there in the 11th century where there was a China who believed it had a role. There was a Russia who believed it was apart from the West. The West was fatigued from, basically Western Europe was fatigued from decades of conflict, and so whatever's going on in your country is going on in your country, and whatever's going on in mine is mine, and I'm sovereign, you're sovereign, we leave each other alone. And of course the Islamic world that had manifested under, in the 600s, and then of course with the Ottoman Empire. Those pieces started, and they haven't really stopped. But now when you start to think about that order, you'll see a lot more of the realist dimensions of a China and a Russia. And I bring that up so that you understand the conflict that everybody has in reconciling what that means. I was fascinated by the book Black Wind, White Snow. And in that book, the author describes the people who had nearly died in the gulags of Russia or the Soviet Union and had lost many of their relatives, would be some of the first to lament the demise of the Soviet Union, because they believed they had it half right. The half wrong part, President Putin is approaching this, the Eurasianism and the nationalism at play, the competition in those former places they call his sphere of influence, and I believe that's what he would like to see return. And you could argue, if you step back and look at the map of A2 AD capability, it covers much of what was the old sphere of influence. For China, they have the long view, and they have been working very diligently at the competitive space. They compete on every dimension, right? The Russians are probably more aggressive in the information domain, but the Chinese have been very aggressive in education, industry, space, and cyber. And certainly I don't see them slowing down whatsoever. And so the challenge becomes those who don't see it, whether you agree with it or not, these people are in competition with you. And that matters because of the capabilities they bring. So what's the so what of that? The other piece here, the third dimension, is the relationship with industry. And this is probably not as spoken about as much, but if you go back to the 40s, the DoD, or the military, was the leader in thought, was the leader in tech development, was the leader in research, and it drove the engine. And there was a lot of things that happened because the military went there first for the necessity of the survival of the nation. Okay. Then over time, there's a transition, right? And so you can get into the 80s where it was much more of a cooperation in terms of what was going on. Certainly there would be tech here from the military, and there'd be tech from industry. But I would argue now, in the 21st century, in the 2019 dynamic, that the way we operate, partly because of the budgets, partly because of what we're after, partly because of how we acquire, we are in a very different relationship with industry. Let me explain that a little bit more. You know, our on-again, off-again budgets don't make us that bet that we need to be. I think we're getting better at that, and I think our acquisition programs are getting a little bit better. But, you know, if you are a CEO, are you going to put your money and your talent and your profit return on a long-term, low-yield CD or on a hot stock where you're going to get rapid return on investment? And ladies and gentlemen, the military largely is that long-term, low-yield CD. And it's going to deliver over time, but the model for how we drive programs and how we make money back and forth is an issue, right? The competition for programs is not about design, but about winning the sustainment dimension of this more than winning the design. And certainly if I'm going to keep something forever, that has its own implications. So we have to, I think, begin to rewire this relationship with industry. Let me speak a little bit more about what's happened in the past. You know, when we get into competitive domains, right, so when in the maritime domain, it became a global common, and it drove great improvements because of the revenue to be made and what it meant to countries. Following World War II, the air domain became a place for great revenue, and it was a global common, and it drove a lot of innovation and capabilities. What then about space and cyber? And we could argue with all that we're seeing is that space is now becoming an economic domain. There is an economy growing with space. And so the challenge is, how do you connect the defense domain to where the weight of innovation and the weight of competition is going? And I think that's an important thing for us to ask ourselves, and it brings into some serious questions. So when you just kind of reflect on that, there's a national consensus, there's an international consensus, and there's a relationship with industry that has changed over that, basically that 80-year period. And I think those are important dimensions. So when I step back and I think about what General Welch had to say, I said, okay, there's some things I need to really ponder. My time in UCOM taught me one thing very important, is that we, after years in the CT domain, have not thought about what we would call an adversary's theory of victory as completely as we should. You know, on the hard end, the worst end, it would be about being put on the horns of a dilemma where you are going to either walk away because you can't compete, or you're going to stick your face in the wood chipper, neither of which are advantageous to you as the West. Which means after being studied for decades, then what makes us capable and what makes us a very powerful alliance has to be the thing that we protect. And we have to think much earlier in conflict as we were to compete in the classic phase 0, 1, and 2. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is the strategic space that we have to think about. And if we don't understand that, we're going to find ourselves missing the boat. And all the years in CT's made that a difficult time. The next question is, do you have to win every issue? And do you have to win every event? And I believe you don't. I believe you have to win the ones that count, though. And I think you have to be honest about which ones count and which ones don't. And you have to be honest about where power comes from and where your freedom of movement is. For us as the Americans, we absolutely have to bring in those things that promote stability for our allies, right? So when I ponder about, you know, the issues that we need to contend with, we have to understand that much, much more clearly than we do. I think we have to do a better job of building and keeping what I call margin. And there's a lot of dimensions to margin. Margin in terms of strategic capital with our allies, margin in terms of capacity of our industries to respond to a new threat or a new challenge, margin in you know, how fast we bring things to the market. You can look at margin as a static thing, like in cyber, and I believe that's a recipe for disaster. But you have to be able to think about how I create enough margin, and certainly the pace that I keep to maintain that margin. These are very different kinds of topics. I believe when you think about those, your strategy and your approach has to attack the strategy of your enemy, who, oh, by the way, is attacking your strategy. And so this isn't about lining up a task force of military or doing the classic things that we've done in CENTCOM for years. This is about thinking about space and cyber and competitive advantages in markets and those kinds of things that are incredibly important. And we can be pulled in 1,000 directions. The idea, I believe, with the agility is to make, like my old GPS would do when I took a wrong turn, it says recalculating, right? And a little arrow would turn round and round. And that's the name of the game. And if you have enough margin, then you can do that. And I believe that's incredibly important. And so for those in D.C. and in our capitals, the idea of setting a pace that we can sustain. And so, I mean, I read a lot of books, and I read about back in the late 1800s as we were dealing with the Comanches. And the American, basically the Texas Rangers, they would begin to chase the Comanches who were on superior mounts. And it took several years for us to figure out that if you didn't catch them in the first 10 minutes and you kept up the chase, you were probably dead. Because they would chase you, you would chase them, knowing full well they'll just run you into the ground, and as soon as your horses died, they'd come back and clean you up. So you can try to set a pace in a race you can't keep, or you can pick the races that you can set the pace and have the dominant hand. And I believe that's where we need to be thinking about. I believe we have to be very mindful of the decision space, both for our rivals and for our allies. Not all of our rivals, I think, have all the tools to really rationally sort out escalation and what they're up against and what their equities are. And so it takes a lot of stepping away from the mirror imaging and understanding, what they have on the table. And to understand maybe sometimes it's us taking 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 punches before we do anything. I remember working one of the big exercises in one of the war games in Europe, and one of my RAF friends says, "You Americans in your OODA loop." I said, "Yeah, OODA loop." He goes, No, it's observe, overreact, destroy, and apologize. Touche, right? So before we try to, treat everything as a hammer and a nail, we have to really be thoughtful about how that plays out. I'm not going to go into any commentary about any of the scenarios out there, but this is chess on 3 dimensions and not checkers. And I think that's something that we have to be very, very mindful of. The decision space and the equity of our allies. One of the things we have going for us is amazing, amazing teammates. And I consider those who are on our would-be rivals team, and I think we've got it made. But I think that means we have to be very thoughtful about the decision space of each and every one of our allies and have that conversation. I know when we talked about the nuclear posture review in Europe and how we managed that thing, we had tremendous engagement, and I thought that's how things should be done. But for us in the military, we have to make sure that we can give our best military advice. And so if you take a step backwards to the 80s or the 40s, or even 10 years ago, our best military advice might be a little one-sided and short-sighted. I think from a resources standpoint, this ability to create margin, let me talk a little bit about that. The 2 A words, adaptability and agility, and how they make the most important A word, and that's affordability. Okay, and I believe that there's ways to get after this. We have, in Global Strike, have really pursued an affordability dimension of all the acquisition. That's stable requirements, mature technologies, owning the tech baseline, a competitive environment, digital engineering where you can have that rapid upgrades and those capabilities, and certainly to get things on time and work about your block upgrades. In the programs that I've dealt with in the 1 year I've I've been in office and I've had multiple attempts to tweak and modify the requirements. And we had our RFP out on the street on time a few weeks ago for the GBSD. And that caught a lot of people's attention because a major acquisition program like that, we stayed on time. That's an important piece. And when I think about, you know, all of that going forward, we've got to be smart. And we just had a conversation about the test enterprise inside the Air Force, and I think we're at that spot where we need to be really thoughtful about, you know, is it tactics development or creating combat capability? Another book I read not long ago was Why Air Forces Fail. And if you read that book and just think for a second, it's not about air forces or it's about navies and armies, it's about modern militaries. And it goes through these vignettes of how they fail. And the takeaway is no one of those vignettes of failure were centered on TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures. It was about the inability to anticipate the nature of conflict, to have the right kinds of things and the right adaptability and margin in place, because the character and the nature of war are such you can't pinpoint it. But I step back and I ask the requirements business of how I buy a radio these days, or how I buy anything. Industry requires and technology permits very precise manufacturing. And when you become so efficient and so effective and so precise, you have no speed. You don't have the agility. And I think that's a recipe of concern that we need to be very mindful of. Consider the B-1, the B-2, and the B-52. Big fan of all three airplanes. The B-52 has taken me to war several times and brought me home. I love that airplane. And of the three, the youngest of the three is the B-52, based on the life remaining in the airplane and the margin, the capability that I have to do something more with it. It is like an old pickup truck that I can modify again and again and again. And when I go back to where General Welch explained, you know, with the B-1, how they had to get it on the ramp. Well, there wasn't a ton of margin left for the B-1 or the B-2. The B-58 Hustler was a great airplane, and when General Welch told me when he was talking to General LeMay, why did you kill the program? He goes, it's too small. I couldn't do anything with it. It was a pretty cool niche platform. But if we're honest with ourselves, we'll be a little smarter like the Navy, who builds swap in space with extra power and room because they know they're going to modify it. And I believe we have to start working our way into that. But I think the way we've done this thing kind of puts us at odds a little bit with the industry, and we have to continue to refine that. In some cases, we're not the priority. In some cases, you know, the budgets that we have, like I said, and certainly the hot economy make it difficult. And so I can't fault industry for that. I think that's a different approach and a different mindset that we have to take on. I'm very proud to say in the Air Force that Dr. Roper's efforts have wrested 100 years of acquisition out of the acquisition system. 100 years of all the programs. And we've had some success here recently. And I think that's heading in the right direction, but it's going to take much more. So let me just bring this all back together, if I could. Deterrence is important, and I think what we do in Global Strike and what we do in Fleet Forces and what we do in STRATCOM, foundational to stability across the globe. And the things that we're doing now from a modernization and sustainment are the entering arguments. But when we step back, it's a much more complicated conversation. It's really one about a sustained long-term competition. The context of the past is not central to today. I do deal with people every now and then who want to go back to the 80s because it worked, it was simple, and they believed that that's how it should be done. Some of those are true. Some things are written in blood that just have to be that way. But I believe we have to continue to challenge the thinking and to continue to challenge the requirements that drive us into some of these exquisite solutions. I think there has to be constant energy as we as partners and allies think about this multi-dimensional chess game and how we compete when there are those who have a very clear agenda to be a regional, if not a global hegemon. I've seen several things where I believe the intent on the part of a would-be adversary would be to unseat the United States as a more rightful, not rightful, but a more well-postured leader of the free world. On the terms of consensus, since it's not clear and it's rapidly changing, I think for us as military leaders, we have to be really thoughtful about how we step back and paint both sides of the picture instead of just advocating for our opinion, and to be able to give what is our best military advice going forward, because it won't be as clear and as crisp, and we won't be the only voice in the conversation. So how we add value to that conversation in a thoughtful, methodical way is absolutely paramount. Those are my thoughts. Part of that's through scar tissue and reading and experience across my time in the acquisition and as a DCOM at European Command, as a JFAC, and certainly the last year I've had here in Global Strike Command. So I don't know how I'm doing on time, but are we in a spot for Q&A? Is that what you guys wanted, or?
So you talked about the allies we have now. What do you think about trying to acquire some new allies, for example,
On India? Well, I tell you, I'm going to point you to the Pacific Command team and to the Joint Staff on that. I mean, and rightfully so, right? So, you know, I'm an air component, and I believe, you know, we do have a relationship, but to be able to sit here and tell you how that needs to go, it'd be out of my lane. Okay, what else?
Hello, Gregor McCallan from the Australian Department of Defence. You mentioned before that there were some areas that the US may not want to compete in. The harder part of strategy is always saying what you're not going to do. Are there any particular areas where you think the US shouldn't be competing, or it's a waste of time to be competing in that area? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm probably not going to give you a crisp answer there because, you know, one, this is live streaming, and so, you know, at the end of the day, I believe that there's a deeper dialogue amongst our countries. I believe we have some good, there are many alliances or partnerships where the strengths and the weaknesses are nicely augmented. You know, my time around, you know, I've worked with air forces on every continent, and we don't have to be everything to everybody, but I know that there's some allies out there who are very good at some stuff. And so we would be really smart to continuously think about how we fold those in. Okay. All right. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump off the stage. I want to say thank you for all for making the time for this important event, and please stay engaged. Thank you.
All right, thank you, General Ray, and we will take a 20-ish minute break where you'll please transition to the panel room next door, and our panel 4 will begin at 14:25. Thank you.